Thank you, and thank you to Olivier and Lamis for your presentations. You know, I was thinking as I was seeing people come in that when you have a country-specific session like this one, a case study late in the afternoon, that you always run the risk of having low attendance, right? More people on the panel than in the audience. So in this case, it's good to see that Yemen has many friends, and so we have it's heartening to see all of you here. Thank you for coming. So I'm going to use my 10 minutes to talk about, as you mentioned, the analysis that the World Bank has been carrying out. This is work that in the team we started in the middle of last year based on a request from the government of Yemen through the Ministry of Planning and International Cooperation. And the idea here, the main message of this work is that we did this work to look at the binding constraints and opportunities for rural development. And how this ties into this session and the topic we are discussing here on resilience is that the insights, as Karim helpfully mentioned, will feed into the design of future projects. And this will lead to hopefully contribute to enhance food security and will help to build resilience. And ultimately, considering what Olivier has shared in the first presentation about the impacts of these two on civil conflict, that this will then ultimately also help to reduce conflict and strengthen rural governance. So in terms of the outline, I'll go quickly through the objectives and then focus on the analysis and the implications for future projects. So the objective of the analytical work overall was to provide some analytical support that will provide knowledge for interventions in rural development. And specifically thinking about this in the context of a decentralizing state. So just quickly, if you think about the World Bank's support to the program in Yemen, we have to think about the macro level, as Olivier shared, about the drivers of conflict, and that includes, of course, the socio-economic and political economy issues. But in this work, we were thinking specifically about how to inform projects and interventions. And in terms of the expected outcomes, again, thinking back to the research, that if you think about strengthening, I'm looking here at the 2 points, the points 2 and 3, and the expected outcomes. If you think about strengthening participatory governance for rural communities in implementing projects, then you think about how this would lead to reduced conflict. And on the first point, one of the goals of our work was to look at all the strategies that the government has in sectors that underpin rural development. So there's an agriculture sector strategy, there are strategies for water, fisheries, rural roads, electricity. And the question was, how can we bring some coordination and pull these together for a consolidated rural development agenda? And the expected outcome from that would be, of course, improved food security, which would also build resilience. So the way we designed this work is we thought through a number of pillars for rural development. So you probably can't see very well from the back, but these pillars include analysis and monitoring, which looks at the natural resources and the landscape in rural areas. And secondly, the rural organizations and institutions that work in rural development. So for example, SFD, which Lamis has been sharing. And then lastly, the private investment that is really needed to improve rural incomes. Now, thinking about these three pillars, we thought through components of analytical work that would match each of these. So for the analysis and monitoring of landscapes and natural resources, we have a landscape and resiliency analysis. My colleague Hanan here in the front has been leading that work with a team also from University of Washington, and I'll share more on that in a minute. In terms of rural organizations, again, I'll describe that in detail. So what we did there was a rural institutional mapping. And then in assessing the constraints and opportunities for building rural business, we did a rural investment climate assessment. So now on to the analysis and findings. And I should state that these are preliminary findings. We are hoping to complete this work in June. And since there's also a video in the back, I'll say that this doesn't represent a final findings from the World Bank or the executive directors. This is preliminary work for discussion at this event. On the landscapes and resiliency analysis, the reason why we thought through doing this was we know that 60% of Yemen's population lives in rain-fed rural areas, and about 70% of agriculture in Yemen is rain-fed agriculture. Now this is therefore an agricultural system that is really vulnerable because the main resource there is rainfall. And so since water is scarce and becoming scarcer in Yemen, if you think about it, these arrows here indicate that as you have increased water scarcity and of course volatility in food production in these areas, that will of course lead to higher food insecurity and vulnerability. And so there's a need to build resilience by addressing the root cause, which is water scarcity. The second pathway described up there is that, of course, as you have water scarcity, you have more competition over water, and that leads to conflict. So the objective here was to understand the vulnerability and opportunities for building resilience in rain-fed rural areas in Yemen. The primary analysis here was a geospatial analysis, and what that means is that the team took maps that indicate the biophysical structure of these landscapes, and these include maps of the elevation, soils, land use change, and changes in the total water storage. Think about groundwater, for example. And using all of those, the team came up with some findings on how thinking about water as the main driver of development in these landscapes areas. Thinking about water, how all of these maps can give you a complete assessment of the landscapes, the biophysical landscapes of the rural areas, especially thinking about rain-fed areas. And this geospatial analysis, of course, uses information that's been collected through, for example, satellite mapping. And we are, in our next steps, we are hoping to validate this by confirming from information on the ground in Yemen how rain-fed communities have already been coping, what kind of coping strategies they have to deal with water scarcity, because we know that these coping strategies are not static and the livelihoods change over time. So to try to figure out how they are coping both with the water scarcity on the climate side and also in terms of social changes like migration from these areas into cities. So we will be producing a policy note based on this work. But in the meantime, one of the other outputs that we have, which we think could be really useful, is this tool called a dynamic information framework. And we put this on the site. What this basically is we are taking those maps, the biophysical characteristics of the landscapes, and incorporating them on this website. And it should help to give you, as I said, a complete assessment that can then help decision makers in thinking about strategies for improving resilience. So this, not only do we have this information on the website as a full picture of what's happening in these areas, but this website can also take updated information so that this tool can be updated over time to make it more meaningful and useful. So that's the first component of the analysis. So there are two more I'll describe to you quickly. The second one was, as I said, if you think about rural organizations and their capacity for implementing projects, then as a way to assess that, we went through a rural institutional mapping. And this looked at both formal institutions, which would be, for example, the local branch offices of the Ministry of Agriculture, which works with farmers, and also informal institutions. Yemen has very strong traditions and structures that have been in place over time for governing land and water. So this assessment of the rural institutions gave us some findings that we can then incorporate into projects. So for example, we find that on the informal side, there are very strong institutions that have been instrumental in planning and implementing projects. The example here is, of course, the IFPRI projects that we've been hearing about, and I'll come back to how this feeds into projects in a minute. But the idea here is how can the formal institutions, such as I mentioned the Ministry of Agriculture, learn from these experiences. And then the third component of our analysis is on assessing the climate for rural business to identify constraints and opportunities for improving rural incomes through improving rural business. And the methodology here was to use an investment climate assessment that the World Bank team did in 2010 and update that by looking at some studies on value chains, fish, honey, etc. And the main findings here were that there are, as you can imagine, really strong constraints in terms of infrastructure, such as electricity and transportation, and also on the finance side, access to finance for groups that wish to engage in rural business. And in addition, on the value chain, there are also constraints with certification or storage or the impact of regulations such as the ban on wheat exports. However, there are also strong opportunities that projects can take advantage of. There are opportunities for branding, for example, thinking about coffee from Yemen, opportunities for improving business skills, or looking at alternative technologies for addressing the needs of infrastructure. So looking at these three analyses, I'll now give you a quick picture. What are the implications for designing projects? So we have heard about the successful experiences in building resilience from the SFD projects, and thinking about future projects now. What can we use some of these, what can we use some of this information for? So first, on the landscape and resiliency analysis, as I mentioned, we have better information now about water scarcity, the biophysical environment in these areas, and we believe this can feed into the design of future projects such as the proposed Climate Resilience of Rural Communities project. And quickly, this is a project that is being implemented with funds from the Climate Investment Funds. It's being led by SFD, which will be the implementing agency. And so we have had some discussion about how to use, for example, that dynamic information framework, the website I shared earlier, in assessing the project sites and thinking about interventions. So that's one example. And on the institutional mapping, as we have a better understanding now of how these institutions work and how strong they are, the primary way we are thinking about using this is there's a $36 million project funded by the Global Agriculture and Food Security Program, GAFS, that will be implemented in Yemen over the next 5 years. And the question here is how can the Ministry of Agriculture, in its planned reforms, promote stronger linkages between the branch offices and institutions on the ground, both the informal and formal, such as NGOs and universities. And we would hope that by strengthening that participation, if we look maybe 6 years from now, that if you look at the results of the GAPS project, you would have positive outcomes such as what we have seen in the IFPRI projects that have been under implementation. And then lastly, on the rural investment climate assessment, we have excellent findings there on how to serve the needs of rural business. And it calls for promotion of private sector participation in increasing that in rural areas. How to do that is still an open question, but two ways that we can think about this is a lot of those needs that were identified, electricity, transportation, are public goods. And so perhaps some of the work that can be done is to look at how to align the public sector expenditure to provide these public goods. And that was one of the outcomes of the National Food Security Strategy recommendations, which will be shared in a minute. And so we are hoping to contribute to that through a review of rural public expenditure. So I'll end there with thanks.
Thank you very much.